Welcome to Off Panel.
Yo everybody, welcome to Off Panel. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of books like The Spire, Cry Havoc, and the upcoming Angelic. It's Si Spurrier. Thanks for coming on, Si.
Hello, thank you very much. An absolute pleasure.
So this podcast is largely about Angelic, your upcoming image series with Caspar Wijngaard, Jim Campbell, Emma Price. I'm going to kick off the podcast with a question that all creators secretly hate to answer, and I hate putting this upon people.
This is about the size of my junk. I'm very disappointed.
It is. Please, I need deep, depth, everything. What is the book all about? So, Si, what is Angelic all about?
Oh my God.
Isn't it funny
okay.
how people kind of hate answering that question? It's hard to answer.
It is. And I mean, personally, I would say the harder the question is to answer, the more interesting the book probably is, which is the horrible dichotomy at the heart of trying to sell one's story. Okay, because I am crass and have spent far too much time thinking about this, the elevator pitch is it's Wall-E meets Watership Down with just a tiny flourish of The Handmaid's Tale, which is I concede, totally bizarre cocktail of elements. It's the story about the Earth after humanity has disappeared, and it's this kind of ruined, toxic wasteland, and the only thing that looks remotely like civilization is, it's kind of the leftovers of mankind's centuries of bad science, and by that I mean it's a bunch of genetically modified animals, which were probably created for some ancient war that may or may not have actually been fought. They have no recollection of it. They're sort of artificially intelligent. They've been spliced with bits of technology. They've had their genes changed, and they live in these funny little, quite childlike societies with some sort of quite dogmatic religious / cultural preoccupations, which have to do with their concept of the makers, which is presumably the people who made them. And it's just a really interesting, tribal, strange world. But in the midst of all this, our central character is Cora, and she is a young monkey with wings. And I know. There's no easy way around saying that doesn't make it sound daft. But it's awesome, and she's just curious and quizzical and adventurous and rebellious. And it's her curse to have been born into this society that despises all of those things. And in order to be good, in order to be
a good monk.
Yes, a good monk. Yeah, well, they have this kind of beautiful little patois of their own, which is quite childlike, and it's this. I don't know if you've read Canticle for Leibowitz, that whole sort of strange, cultish culture. That sounds crazy, but you know what I mean. Building up around kind of misunderstood or half understood stuff. That's what the monks are. They're this little cargo cult of childlike monkeys, and they speak in a kind of childish way, and they do all the things that they think the makers wanted them to do without really understanding what it is. And for Cora, the tragedy is that when she becomes an adult, which is very, very soon, she knows that she has to go through this weird ritual where she's going to lose her wings. Because in their conception of what it means to be a good female, you have to settle down and you don't get to fly around anymore. And that's awful. And it's not only awful because it's awful, but it's awful because she realizes it's awful, and she's desperate to keep her wings. She senses that this is a tyranny, and so she flies away, and she gets into all sorts of strange adventures and encounters the enemies, and just sort of ends up learning an awful lot about the world and herself and the makers, while just exercising her right to be free and have adventures.
Yeah, she is. I have to say, Cora is a wonderful character, and I'm not saying this lightly, and I don't want to overhype it for my listeners, but I actually think like I read the first 2 issues of Angelic, and it's one of my favorite new comics of the year. I absolutely love it. It's wonderful. But I do want to say one of the underrated parts about your elevator pitch, which is great. I love that you actually have an elevator pitch at the ready, is Wally, because I feel like Angelic is like low key an all ages book.
Yeah.
Which is funny because I feel like comics in general and Image in particular, in terms of monthlies, kind of lack all ages books. So it was heartening to read a book that I'm like, I can hand this to anybody.
Sure, and it's kind of a mission statement / challenge that we set ourselves when we set out to make this book. And by the way, Wall-E is not only one of my favorite films, but a film that I can waffle about for hours. But the very, very short version, the reason that film is so very, very spectacular is that it is the perfect example of a controlling idea. And my version of what it means to have a controlling idea is the shortest distillation of the central theme, moral, axiom, epigrammatic truth, whatever that is, which lies at the heart of not only the story, but also every scene, every line of dialogue, every character arc, literally everything in the story. And for Wall-E, it's 5 words. It's irrational love overcomes life programming. And you can look at literally any moment, any 20 minutes, any hour and a half of that movie, and it is a version of that story. And that is spectacular and elegant and beautiful. And when you have that sort of elegance at the heart of a story, it means that things like age range, target audience, are incredibly elastic. Mm-hmm. And so the reason that Wall-E is one of the things we go to when we're talking about Angelic, not only because it's a sort of post-apocalyptic fable that features technology and robots, but it's also, and this is true of an awful lot of Pixar films actually, a really great example of a movie that you can watch when you're 8 or you can watch when you're 80, and you will have completely different but totally joyous viewing experiences. Mm-hmm. And in comics, we tend to use the phrase all ages in a kind of euphemistic way to mean, well, it's for kids, isn't it? It's an all ages book, but it's for kids, guys. Hey, it's for kids. It's for kids, right? You can read it, but it's for kids.
Right.
Angelic, what we really wanted was literally an all ages book that a kid can sit down and read, and it's a fun adventure about monkeys and dolphins, and it's just great fun adventure. Or you can sit down knowing a little more about the world and realize that there's it just drips with allegory and analogy about religion and faith and culture and gender and all the things that I'm excited and interested about. So yeah, it's kind of, that was the challenge. Can we make a comic that will hit both ends of the spectrum and every bit in the middle of the spectrum? And I think, based on some of the feedback we've had, like we keep getting these wonderful testimonials from people we sent the book to, and it's always, I read the book, I loved it, it's really cool, hooray. By the way, I also read it with my kid, and my kid loved it too, and that means so much when you get that sort of feedback.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. And I do think that the animated world is kind of an underrated, I don't want to say medium, but like it's a underrated section of film that is fantastic at delivering stories like that, even beyond Pixar. I mean, Studio Ghibli is obviously amazing at it. I'm ride or die with the How to Train Your Dragon series. Anyways, but I
did you see Kubo yet? By the way,
God, I love Kubo so much.
That went straight in my top 10. What an amazing movie!
It's so good. I love Laika, but that I think was their masterpiece. But I do think it's kind of spectacular. Like you think about, I remember seeing Toy Story 3 in theaters, and all the kids were like, "Yay, toys!" And all the parents were just crying, just like crying their eyes out. And it is funny because like I do think that Angelic taps into that, in that you can appreciate it from a joyful adventure standpoint, but also there's like depth to it. Also, Wall-E does have. I'm not going to spoil who the Mans are, but they have large things in floating devices that drive them around. So anyways, I did want to ask, I almost said the word genre. I wanted to ask a question before we get into the development of the book. I was reading another interview you had done where you said you were, and I quote, no great fan of the idea of genre in general. And that's a subject I find really interesting, especially given the fact that Angelic is kind of hard to pin down into one specific genre, nor would you necessarily want to.
Sure.
Why is the idea of genre something you're not really a fan of?
Oh heavens! This is one of those pub rants that I'll go off on one and just not shut up for hours. And the difficulty is always distilling it down. I guess, okay, so it's not so much that I have a problem with the notion of genre. I understand that as consumers of narrative, as consumers of fiction in specific, but in general, consumers of narrative, it is useful to us to be able to compartmentalize and taxonomize certain types of stories. I get that. Although, a slight side point, I think that we put far too much emphasis on that, and we would probably be a lot happier if we just dove into stories because they're stories rather than because we think we know what we're going to get. Anyway, that's a separate issue. The problem really is with the language that we use, or rather the language we have inherited, the terminology we have inherited to describe genres. And for instance, just pick a bunch at random, Western, horror, comedy, romance, murder. Right. That's one location, one emotion, one inciting event, and I can't even remember what the rest of them are. But my point is, all these different words describe different things. They're not describing the same sort of thing. They're not telling you anything useful about the shape of the story that you're about to encounter. The kind of the obvious example, the thing that drives me mad, is when people describe something as a superhero movie or a superhero comic.
Right.
What they're actually saying is this is a story that has superheroes in it. It doesn't tell you whether it's a war comic or a murder comic or a crime comic or a comedy or a romance or what the fuck ever. It just tells you it's got people who wear masks in it. And that's not really very useful when it comes to knowing anything about a story. So I don't know that I have a solution to this other than whenever, and Angelic's not the first time this has happened. In fact, I don't know that it's ever not happened. When I've created a new thing and people say, okay, so what's the genre? It's usually a list of like 5 or 6 words, and that's frowned upon. You're supposed to be able to give 1 or 2 at the very most in order to keep it nice and sharp and impactful when describing something to people. And I guess I feel like that's a tragedy, because what it means is that everybody's constantly trying to operate within these restrictive little pigeonholes that really don't, when you think about it, benefit anybody except administrators, people who like to put things in boxes. They have no function to retailers or consumers, and certainly not creators, except to constrain them. So yeah, I have a kind of reluctant acceptingness of the fact that we need to organize our stories just for the sake of them not being chaotic, but we've got it completely wrong at the moment.
Yeah, I don't remember what, right. I think it was, I always attribute it to John Layman, so John Layman may be getting way too much credit for me, but John, you're getting it anyways. I believe he kind of posed the question to me as like, what genre is life? Because life is...
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's like, what is, it's everything. It's like, depending on the situation, it might be a comedy, it might be a tragedy, it might be a drama, it might be this. I mean, it's like, something like Angelic touches on all kinds of different things, and to classify it as one thing is unnecessarily limiting.
Right.
And so it is a fascinating question. I just read that and I was like, I gotta dig into that. I knew that would be a thing, though.
But Angelic's a really interesting example, and somebody was asking me about this the other day. For the purposes of orienting people's expectations, it is legitimate to describe Angelic as a post-apocalyptic story.
Right.
But if you see that same story through the point of view of the protagonist, who has no idea what an apocalypse is, what the human world looked like before it all got destroyed, she's living in a world of mystery and monsters and beauty and wonder. And so is it a post-apocalyptic story or is it a kind of adventure fable? The answer is it's both, but that's already 3 words instead of 1 word. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's problematic.
Yeah, I whenever I think of genre and like the expansion of it, I think of when Shaun of the Dead came out and they're like, it's the first rom-com. I'm like, you guys are being
which
ridiculous.
is very smart,
Yeah. Anyways, all right. So back to Angelic proper. So what are the origins of Angelic? Was it an idea you've been noodling around with for a while, or is it something you kind of developed with Caspar in hand, or how did it develop?
A little bit of both, I think. Actually, I mean, I have a sort of file. Well, it's actually a whiteboard that's always on my wall, and it's just a list of things, a list of projects which are abstractly in development, and some of them are quite crystallized. I've got stories which are basically plotted and ready to go, and I've got other things which might just be a title or might just be half an idea. So that when an opportunity arises to pitch for something, or as in this case, when I identify an artist who I really want to work with and I go after them, I'm able to say, I've got a bunch of ideas, let's talk, let's jam. In this case, and in fact, almost every fucking case, when you've got, as I said, you've got, 4 ideas, 3 of them are ready to go, there's like 0 effort involved, you can just sit down and write the fucker. And then there's one that's just half an idea. That's always the one they go for because life is unkind like that. But it generally works out for the best, because what it means is that you can. And by the way, I'm kind of interrupting myself all over the place because my brain does that. But with Caspar, I saw his work on Limbo, which was written by Dan Waters. Both of them are great talents. I couldn't work with Dan right then, although, P.S., I am currently co-writing The Shadow with him over at Dynamite, so I'm keeping him busy too. But I could absolutely headhunt Caspar. So I sent him a bunch of ideas. We went through a few of them. He liked what eventually became Angelic the most, and per the scenario I've just described, it was, of course, the least developed of them all. Typically enough. But as I say, it worked out great because it meant that we could develop it together. And this always sounds like a cliche when I say it, but there is nothing quite so wonderful as looking at a comic and not being able to remember whose idea that was, or this was, or that was. I'm pretty sure that there are whole plot twists coming down the pipe which would not or could not be there if Caspar hadn't casually come up with little things when he was doing sketches or design. So it's the sort of genuinely collaborative process that you don't quite get in any other medium. And I say this, I've just come off a stint doing some TV stuff, so that's about as collaborative as it gets, but in a far more aggressive, territorial, overlappy Venn diagram-y sort of way, rather than the kind of symbiotic, greater than the sum of its parts thing that tends to happen in comics. So to answer your question, it came about because I really, really love Caspar's work, and he just liked that idea, and we just ran with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think is kind of cool is, I'm not saying that people wouldn't promote their own books in general, but I've kind of got the vibe from Caspar on Twitter that he is like over the moon about Angelic. and I don't know, I mean, it kind of feels like this, sometimes you can feel that like one person is more into it than the other one. This one definitely feels like you guys are kind of 2 people who are moving in the same direction, and that direction is like to the moon. You guys are just overjoyed by the project.
It's yeah, I mean, you're not wrong, and it's so much harder for artists because, probably not much of a secret here, but as creatives, we're all desperately insecure and really hungry for people to say, oh, I'm excited, and I'm looking forward to seeing that. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're working with Image especially, but for any publisher, frankly, if you're a writer, you're probably working on 3 or 4 or more projects at any one time, so you're probably getting acknowledgement, feedback on Project X while you're busy developing Project Y.
Right.
If you're an artist, you're probably only working on one thing at a time. And with Image, and frankly most publishers, you're not even going to announce that project until you are 2 or more issues into drawing it. Mm-hmm. And so poor Caspar's sitting there slowly going mad because, to all intents and purposes, he appears to have just disappeared. He's dropped off the radar.
Right.
Whereas he's sitting there drawing these things that are making him crazy excited. He's sending them to me and Emma and Jim, and we're all telling him it's amazing, but nobody knows he's working on this. So the moment you are allowed to announce, it's not just because it's a good thing to do for promotion and all the rest of it. It's also psychologically really important because suddenly Caspar's going, you know what? I'm not the only one who's excited by this. I am entitled to be excited by this. And I think it kind of becomes a feedback loop, which makes everybody feel really healthy and enthusiastic about it.
Yeah. There is like a fascinating inequity on the art side. I'm not going to get into the art cred thing, but I did want to mention, I find it fascinating that, like, you know, Caspar has to sit in the dark for a while, and people are like, oh, what is he up to after Limbo? Or if, like, I was talking to somebody about this on Twitter the other day, it's like a lot of times when books are late, the perception is it's the artist's fault, when quite often it's not necessarily the case. It is interesting how they don't get...
It usually is the artist. They are awful, awful people. You never believe a word they say when they blame writers.
Oh, I know that. I know plenty of artists. I'm just kidding. I love you, artists. But no, I mean, it is kind of fascinating how that works. But, you know, I wanted to ask about your other collaborators. Jim Campbell's lettering the book. You have... I was reading The Spire last night, and that's a book that is just loaded up with, like, all kinds of fascinating and just delightful lettering choices. Sure. You know, Jim comes on this project. It's clearly something that you... like, you're not somebody who's just going to look to do the same thing on every project. What is it that Jim brings to the project?
I mean, well, lettering is one of the most undervalued parts of the collaboration I was waffling about a moment ago. And there are kind of, I don't know quite how to describe them. Puritanicals, I suppose. There are Puritans in comics who think that lettering exists as text and nothing more, and, you know, sort of stripped down, no emphases. There's this sort of trend at the moment for lower casery rather than all caps, and it works in certain scenarios. I guess this is just occurring to me now. You know the old Dogma films?
Yeah.
They had the kind of the list of rules that were sort of self-denying, and it was supposed to emphasize story and character and all the important things rather than worrying about the frills and twills and all the rest of it. Well, great. There are a couple of really great movies that Dogma produced, but there are also some really fucking boring ones, and that's kind of my fear with the lack of interest in utilizing letterers as what I think they are, which is a truly creative tool within the comic creator's toolbox. And ashamedly, I cannot remember her name, but the lady who did the Mask comics.
Oh, I have no idea.
Right, dig those out, because this is, you know, before digital, so this was all done by hand, but it is some of the most exceptional storytelling use of lettering that I've ever seen, and part of the madness of that book is purely down to lettering choices. And to deny yourself the means of using text as a graphic element. You know, we work in this funny medium where we're constantly confusing the received and the perceived information, time for space, all these things. We're constantly screwing with our readers' minds in a kind of synesthetic way to confuse this for that. To deny that you can use speech balloons as graphic elements is denying yourself a tool. To deny yourself the right to emphasize words is denying yourself a means of creating extra drama, and yada, yada, yada. I could go on and on. Mostly this is not the preserve of the writer. We just write shit. Sometimes if I'm doing, for instance, in the first issue of Godshaper, I set poor old Jonas the challenge of this amazing double-page splash.
Which is fantastic.
Thank you. You've seen it. You know what I'm talking about, right? So there's a section where the reader's eye is invited to travel in the wrong direction. And that's almost impossible unless you have an artist who really knows what he's doing, and Jonas really knows what he's doing, and more importantly, a letterer, in that case, Colin Bell, who really knows what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you can position your balloons in such a way that the reader's eye does not feel outraged at bouncing from this to this to this, then you can make the reader look wherever the fuck you want, whether it's left to right, up to down, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Jim's a master of that as well, and he's also a master of choosing precisely the right voice, and we come back to synesthesia here because it's clearly not a voice, it's a typeface. It's nothing to do with voice, it's a visual rather than an aural phenomenon, but that's what you deal with when you're a letterer. You are switching a spiky word for a spiky voice, a bold word for a loud voice, whatever it is, and he deals with that intuitively. What's very funny about Jim is that twice now we've worked together, and both times he's like, yeah, I'm going to try and not go overboard with all the kind of crazy typefaces because there is a limit to this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Then
we get into crazy cybernetic dolphins and insane out-of-phase cats, and he just kind of can't help himself. It works every time. It's really, really good. So yes, he is a very, very important creative part of making the story feel the way it feels.
I do think for a long time, letterers, I remember I had Phonographics tell me this way back in the day, before I think he was even going by Phonographics. He said in an interview with me that basically if you notice my work, then I've done something wrong. And I think that's long been something that's been perceived about lettering. But I actually think we're kind of getting beyond that. I think that there's some stylists out there who are actually doing really great things that fit the work really well. And it makes sense. I mean, creator-owned books are supposed to stand out. And speaking of which, I do want to tout your designer as well, Emma Price. She's fantastic. She did amazing. Yeah, she did amazing stuff on Cry Havoc. Angelic looks fantastic. And like I said, I think good design work is underrated and something that really makes Image Title stand out amongst all the books that kind of, you walk along a comic book stand and it's like there's a homogeny there. Everything kind of looks the same. What is it that makes Emma such an important part of the team?
Well, I guess, for me, and I'm not the expert, that's why we hired her, because she's so bloody good at this. But my guess is that the art of the designer is to intuitively distill everything in a book down to its sort of constituent aqua vitae, and then use that to build back up again, to create. It's brand basically, and that's kind of a dirty word because we're not supposed to talk about brand when we're talking about creation, but that's what Emma's job is. Emma's job is to say everything about this book will be part of a beautiful package with no dissonant notes, which will leap off the shelf. It'll catch your eye. It'll look elegant. It'll look considered. It won't look like somebody's just gone, it's got fucking Captain Fart Pants in, and everybody already knows Captain Fart Pants, so that's going to sell anyway, so we don't really need to worry about whether it looks good or not. And maybe there's a horrible bit of truth in that if you're happening to be making a Captain Fart Pants, but we're not. We're making something new and different and weird and strange, and it's supposed to cover all these bases for every age group, and so that's quite a tall order. And that's what the designer does. The designer makes it's the first port of call. A book will always be judged by its cover. Mm-hmm. Whether the cover art is stunning or not depends entirely on who has assembled it with textual elements. Then you open the thing. Is the interior part of the package the same vibe, the same brand? There's that word again. So I don't know. It's something that is like wizardry to me. I've got sort of crappy MS Paint, and I move things around, and I go, hey Emma, I've created an advert. Is this all right? And she goes, you are useless, and just moves a few pixels around, and it looks incredible. And that's the art. And some people have it, and some people don't. So yeah, she. By the way, we're married, so she's downstairs right now working on Angelic. But I would be hiring her and probably paying her rather more, even if we weren't. I am delighted, by the way, that in the same way that a few years ago, colorists started to be properly noticed as the creative components that they really are. And Cry Havoc was sort of celebrating that and trying to shine a light onto that. I'm delighted that we are little by little achieving the same with all the other elements in a comics team, whether they be letterers or designers or editors, who are the other. We haven't got one of those, so we can't celebrate them. But that's the next thing, I think, is people finally realizing that those two names up above the title are really not in isolation. There's a whole bunch of people going on.
Yeah. I love how designers kind of tie the whole thing together and make it feel much more cohesive. Like, I really love Tom Mueller's stuff. And he has done, like, I don't know if you read Drifter, Ivan Brandon and Nick Klein. And, it's a good book. And I thought Tom's stuff did such a good job of making that book feel so much more cohesive, from the covers to the back covers and everything.
It just feels classy, and we sort of, I think we all come into comics not expecting them to be classy. And so it's very, very seductive when we're like, holy shit, this can be a stylish world. This can be a classy and elegant world. I think that's compelling. By the way, Emma and Tom used to work together, so they're quite good friends. So they're all kind of coming from the same world.
That's awesome. I think it's great. Yeah. So I'm going to take a huge shift. I want to talk about process a little bit. And I have the most important question I'm going to ask you today is going to be right now. I was reading your website's About page, and it says you regard sushi as part of the plotting process. This is a very important fact to me as a huge fan of sushi and food in general. I need more sushi-based details, Si. How important of a factor was sushi on Angelic?
On Angelic, not that much. There's a little bit of fish action, isn't there? There's some raw gobbling of fish, although if I recall, Caspar drew them looking kind of mutated and disgusting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for instance, I just moved out of London. I've lived in London for 16 years. And last week, we moved down to the seaside. And I kind of, I make my own sushi. I can catch fish, kill fish, clean fish, all the rest of it. There isn't a single fresh fishmonger within like 10 miles of where I live, right on the seafront. Whereas in London, you can just walk down the end of the road and there's a sushi place there. So I am going to have to go back to making a lot more of it myself than I ever used to. But that's kind of cool. I'm looking forward to that.
that does sound fantastic. I love that detail. I thought that was really fantastic. But so in terms of the actual process, non-sushi related, how much do you tailor your scripts for Caspar versus how you might have handled them for, say, like Ryan Kelly on Cry Havoc or Jeff Stokely on Spire?
That's a really good question. I think it becomes intuitive, and so I'm kind of working this answer out. I normally have thought through most of these sorts of things, but my guess, thinking back, is that, so for instance, the first time I work with an artist, I have no idea what they are going to want, what they're going to like, because every artist has a different threshold for the amount of detail and the amount of direction that they want. With Cry Havoc, it was such an experimental book and such a hard-boiled, sort of crystallized, rhythmic exercise that I was quite draconian about it. And I use that word without it meaning that I forced Ryan to do anything against his will. We discussed it and he decided that this was how he wanted to work, to the extent that I did like a little diagram for each page that was the layout of the panels, and that's easy enough to do if you're working on a grid format. Mm-hmm. And that worked for Cry Havoc because that was part of the gimmick. With Jeff, almost exactly the opposite. Jeff's just a sort of mad genius who, while always encapsulating precisely the action that I want him to encapsulate, will do it in a way that I could not have conceived. So there's just no point in me trying to say, hey, this should be a small panel that's on the right and it should be angled from this direction and we should see part, because he'll do something different and it'll be better anyway. So I don't put a huge amount of direction into my scripts for Jeff, but an awful lot of description, because the stuff I've done with Jeff has always tended to be quite world building oriented. Mm-hmm. In fact, that was with the Spire, that was the second time Jeff and I worked together. Because I knew him going into it, we've become very good friends. I was able to deliberately leave gaps that I would never normally have done with an artist that I've not worked much with, to say, here Shah meets a character. I have no idea what this guy looks like, but there's something about him which 4 episodes from now, it'll give the game away about XYZ, and Jeff will just come up with something, and that'll be the clue that trailer breadcrumbs leads to wherever we need it to go 4 episodes later. And that's kind of lovely, being able to devolve those little plot nuggets onto somebody who can deal with it in a purely visual way. Mm-hmm. Caspar's probably closer to that end of the spectrum. We have the privilege of working with a world that is all quite new, but also it contains functional elements. You know, we all know what a monkey looks like. So when Caspar draws it, he's creating his kind of colorful, childlike signature version of what a monkey looks like, and then he's sticking wings on it. And he comes from a kind of background in animation, so there's an awful lot of that cell-colored vibe to it. He's very big on his purples and his blues, and that works so very beautifully in this context. So I guess I give him... You know what? I've given him less and less information the further on we've gone.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
I'm a waffly writer anyway. You know, I grew up, I studied comics reading Alan Moore scripts, so it didn't occur to me until 4 or 5 years into my career that there are probably artists who don't appreciate a 3-page panel description. But as I've gone ahead with Caspar, they've just got shorter and shorter and shorter. I think we're down to kind of 1 line per panel by the time we're getting up to kind of issue 5 and 6, because all the stuff's there, and it's just down to him to make it look glorious, and he always does.
Mm-hmm. I was curious about that because it sems like, you'd already mentioned it, like as your collaboration progresses, you kind of get a better, more fine-tuned perspective on how your collaborator wants to work. How far into the book are you guys? Just curious.
He is about halfway through 4. Whoa. I am about halfway through 6.
So you guys will probably be at like 5 by the time the book gets released.
I think so, yeah. When are we? We're released in, I think, September 20 is the drop date. So, yeah, the aim is, there was a version of the schedule before Life that, we were wrapped up with the first 6 before the first one dropped, which would have been a nice luxury, but as I say, Life. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, 5 is probably what we're going to shoot for. I think he'll probably be about halfway through 5 by the time that lad's... He's about to have a baby. Well, he's not. His missus is about to have a baby. So that will inevitably put a dent in things, which is why we were so careful to be so far in advance.
Right.
I think what we're going to do, and this is all kind of... for obvious reasons, you can never quite know what the next thing will look like, but the intention is that we roll directly into 7, 8, 9 and onwards, but probably do like a 2 or 3 month gap in the release schedule just so that he can get ahead of himself again. So because people will tell you this all the time, it's the one thing retailers hate, it's the one thing publishers know retailers hate. If you miss a month, you're doomed. Right. So we're just being very careful not to do that.
Well, and also Image kind of has that built in. I don't know internal memorandums or anything like that, but from what I understand, they encourage people to go with the Saga schedule, which is like that 2 or 3 month gap that you're talking about. Release a trade in there. I know that I'm pretty sure that they require people or require teams to have at least 3 books in the can by the time the book's released. Sounds like you guys are ahead of that. That's great. But I am kind of curious. Between some interviews I read about, your perspective on the industry and the comics press and a lack of sustained attention on books, it kind of feels, and this may be an inappropriate term, but it kind of feels like to a certain degree that you're a little bit jaded about like the comic market after you did Cry Havoc. Had you considered going with a different format or like a shorter length on Angelic, given your recent experiences?
Considered it, yes. I mean, we have talked over everything, and by the way, there are permutations to that Image model that you mentioned before. I think, for instance, you might start seeing creative teams who are so far ahead of themselves that arcs 1 and 2 can be rolled out contiguously.
Right.
That's something we talked about. It just didn't work for us because we want to launch the book at Thought Bubble this year. as I mentioned before, we were all slowly going mad, not being able to announce it. So it just sort of felt right that we wanted to be able to announce it at the earliest opportunity, which meant not sitting in the dark, constantly working and announcing it further on down the line. Yes, schedules are okay. So I mean, what we're dancing around here is the idea that what I said before, which is that you are not, as a creator, right, especially as a creator owner for something like Image, as opposed to one of the big publishers, you have to be, yes, creative, but also you have to have your eye on promotion and marketing. Mm-hmm. Not something any of us expected to have to be any good at, but you really do. For that, you really need to understand the brutal truth, which I did not understand before Cry Havoc. And if I'm jaded, it's just because this is a weird reality. And it doesn't... Well, anyway, let's just get to it. It's this. As a creator, you are not trying to sell your book to the readers. You are trying to sell it to the retailers. And the reason... Well, look, the reason for everything, and this is... I'm generalizing. I'm being horribly diminutive about all of this, but I think it is true that almost everything I grate against in the comics world, whatever that is, can be traced to some degree or another to the present distribution system that we have in the direct market. And that's a really boring fucking end to an exciting sentence, but there you go. Basically, retailers have something like 3 days to work out how many of a book to order based on the sales of the previous issue. Mm-hmm. And if they get it wrong, most of them are only ever one shit decision away from bankruptcy. So these guys have a really shitty deal. They are required by simple survival, simple self-interest, to be extremely conservative with their orders.
Right.
Why would you order more titles, more copies of Angelic than you think are going to sell? Because they're just going to get left on the shelf. So you're going to be conservative with it. Now, if you are conservative, it means that there are always going to be people wanting a copy who didn't get one because there wasn't one in the store. So you immediately get into a situation where the only thing retailers will not be conservative about is the big number one launches, because that's a thing you can completely bank on. So it follows QED that publishers and creators start relaunching books every 5 minutes, start making a big song and dance about the next arc, and the humble ongoing, which was the sort of lifeblood of the industry for so long, has become, well, I don't know if it's endangered. And by the way, just to kind of shoot my own argument in the face slightly, I'm a little bit cynical about ongoings as well, because basically the whole of the comics industry is based on predicted sales rather than retroactive sales. And that hamstrings everybody. And it means that if you are going to try and do an ongoing, there's just no point involving any sort of arc endings, exciting changes. It means that you end up with stagnating storylines. You have to use the illusion of change rather than actual change, yada, yada, yada. And that leads us to fucking 1980s and 1990s superhero comics. Or you go down the route of everything's a miniseries and you relaunch it at the end of every miniseries. And that's kind of where we are now. As you know, because I wrote about this last year, the problem then becomes that the preoccupation is always with launch issues. And people forget that stories have to have good endings as well, because by that point, nobody's paying any interest. Mm-hmm. So I honestly don't know what the solution is. With Angelic and with all my stories, the idea for me is that you have to employ modular storytelling, which is the notion of every arc should have a satisfying ending, but it should also launch into a new arc, which has a new controlling idea. You know, the Wally thing I was talking about before. If you can structure every arc around a different controlling idea, you're fine. Mm-hmm. And that's probably why Image has started utilizing the little gap between arcs, because it means you can release the trade, get people aboard. It's a clever solution to a really shitty setup.
Yeah. Well, and it also gives a chance for people to pick up the trade and get excited and build from there. And then it's 3 months, so shops have the ability to order. And also beyond that, it prevents you guys from getting killed from trying to work 24/7 to get books out every single month.
Right.
I know there's a Skills and Scoundrels is a book that's coming out, I think in September as well, from Sebastian Gerner and Galad, and they're actually going monthly. And like hard monthly, and I am utterly amazed, but I'm actually really excited because I love the book and I'm excited to read more of it. But I do think it's kind of interesting. I was looking through your Comic Vine profile. It seems like besides X-Men Legacy, which was 25 issues, your 2080 work, and some Avatar webcomics, it seems like most of your series are actually shorter. Is that by design, or is that just how does that work out?
It was by design originally. I mean, apropos exactly what I've just been talking about, I was always quite wary of ongoing series. I felt like that was a trap. It was a kind of a lazy man's approach, because it encourages perpetual stories that don't really have any satisfying conclusions, and I believe very firmly that the most important part of any story is its ending, and it actually doesn't matter as a story unless it has an ending. Mm-hmm. So I sort of resisted that until, I mean, I had a lot of fun with X-Men Legacy, and the more new ideas I do, I've been doing comics for 13 years, something like that, and the more of these I do, probably more actually. I think I have a slightly romantic view of how old I am. But the more of these I do, the more I start to think, well, you know what? It would have been lovely if, having approached the ending, I could then stick in an interesting twist and go off in a different direction. And it wouldn't be quite the betrayal of the central story that I always suspected it would be. Mm-hmm. I think as long as you go into something knowing exactly where it will eventually end, basically knowing what the final arc looks like, as long as you are then capable of bolting in these controlling ideas that change each arc, you can probably spin it out as long as you want. I'm wary of this is very rude, and the great man does not deserve this, by the way, and it's the one minor crime of his. But an editor of mine used to describe it as Claremonting, which is where you're just you're halfway through a story and you just throw in some random element because it might be useful later on. You never know, and just sort of constantly spinning because I ran past the door last week. I wonder what's in that door. Oh look, we're in a new story about what's behind the door. So that sort of stuff. That's the downside behind ongoings to me. But yeah, I'm gradually learning to embrace the idea that you can keep telling great stories without having to lose your discipline. Mm-hmm. And all this time I've been a stickler for discipline. I like stories that go in hard, end at exactly the right moment, and then if you ever feel the need to revisit it, it's a sequel. It's not just a continuing story. But, I read Saga and it's magnificent and it never stops being magnificent. And that's just one among many of some really, really good, in inverted commas, ongoings. So I want some of that.
Yeah. That Claremonting term is amazing.
It's funny. He's great, by the way. I think he is one of the very finest, but it does fit as a term.
Oh, absolutely. And I think a lot of people would know what that means, because it is a very Claremontian thing to do. But I wanted to ask, I'm going to finish with Angelic, but I wanted to ask one more question about kind of what you've been doing. I had this question that I was all ready to ask about how it seems like you're more focused on creator-owned stuff these days. But then, it seems like things keep popping up. I didn't realize you were doing a Shadow book, and then you're doing the Dark Crystal, and you're doing Avatar work. Do you feel like you're more focused at this point on creator-owned, or is it just kind of you're just taking where the sea takes you, or going where the sea takes you?
It's, the privilege of being a writer as opposed to being an artist is that you can do a little bit of everything. If you're doing 4 or 5 projects at one time, it makes perfect sense to be dabbling a little bit in the kind of the big shared universe worlds, because it's fun. You grew up with those characters. It's great exposure, and they pay quite well, and that's simple. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you want to be scratching the creator owner itch. You want to be doing exactly what you want to do. So yeah, there are kind of different tide marks on that spectrum. I work a lot with Boom, and they are kind of half creator owned in the sense that it's all my ideas, and I own the intellectual property or share it with the artist. But I also have an editor, and I have a team behind me, and I have all the things that one would generally associate with a kind of licensed publisher. So that's a sort of halfway house, which suits me very well. Mm-hmm. I've been doing a lot of stuff with Marvel. I'm doing more stuff with DC, and I'm doing more stuff with Image. And the shadows. I mean, so I mentioned it earlier on. A couple of months ago, I kind of had this panicky week where I got offered this great gig. It was like a TV job, and I had just signed up to a whole bunch of other projects. And so I had to furiously scrabble around and call up editors and either delay or defer an awful lot of projects. And in a couple of cases, what it ended up being was I'm quite exacting when it comes to plotting anyway. I'm one of those people who will always work things out as tightly as I'm able. Mm-hmm. So with the Dark Crystal book and with the Shadow, what I did was sit down and write an incredibly fiddly, finely detailed outline down to what happens on each page, and then went looking for co-writers who could do the kind of the coalface stuff, the heavy lifting. Mm-hmm. So that's what I've ended up with, and working with Philip Kennedy Johnson over on Dark Crystal, and he's magnificent, and we've got into a great rhythm, and working with Dan Waters, the guy I mentioned earlier on, who wrote Limbo with Caspar, on The Shadow. And in both cases, it's a whole new world for me, this kind of collaborating with another writer. It's really exciting. And again, it has ended up surprising me how often I look at the scripts that they send me, and it's better than what I would have done, simply because they're approaching it from a perspective that isn't mine. And that's so useful when you're constructing narrative. It's all about perspective, and you could be the best writer in the world, but if you're not seeing it from that particular angle, and somebody else is, they are going to have ideas that might be more suitable than yours. And that's wonderful to be able to go looking for those.
It is probably pretty fascinating having like these very exacting plots and then seeing somebody implement them in a different way.
It's weird. It's I mean, I'm not going to lie to you. It's occasionally uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And there are times when I'm like, well, I wouldn't have done it like that. And then I get the right to have a gentle polish of the dialogue at the end, but it's always very respectful. I wouldn't have got these two guys involved if I didn't think that they were eminently capable of doing it, even without me there.
Right.
So it's kind of, it feels like shared ownership now, rather than me saying, jump and them saying how high. So, yeah, it's and to go back to something I mentioned earlier on, the experience I had in TV, which was exciting and fascinating and exhilarating and all the wonderful things, and I want to do more, and I learned a lot, but it's a far more, what's the best term? It's a far more kind of competitive sort of collaboration, in the sense that it's not about I will take your idea and mix it with my idea and we will have a better idea, which is what I'm often experiencing in comics. It's more about, no, I've had a better idea than yours, and therefore we slot that idea into place and we collect the best ideas rather than merging them together. And it's just a different way of working. It's certainly rather more tense.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's nice to be able to see different breeds of collaboration.
Mm-hmm. All right, so a few more questions about Angelic before we go. We know what it's about. We know about its development. It's a fascinating book that touches on, like you said, there was like it's kind of vaguely dystopian. It has these religious undertones and overtones. It has a little bit of everything. What made it specifically a story that you wanted to tell, besides working with Caspar?
I think it's this will sound wrong, but I hope you'll know what I mean. It's about children.
Yeah.
It's about wanting to understand a horribly complicated, often cruel, always surprising, and not always in the best way world through the eyes of an innocent. And I don't know if you've ever stood and watched a group of children at play, but they are by no means nice. They can be fun and garrulous and curious and vivacious and all the wonderful things we associate with youth, but they're also very cruel to each other. Mm-hmm. And that reminded me of kind of monkeys. I don't know why that was the first thing I went to, but there's in the first issue of Angelic, there's like a note, an author's note, in which I describe an experience I had a few years ago at a zoo, watching a whole bunch of little marmosets in a cage. I won't spoil it for you, but it's a nice little anecdote. But there is something extremely childlike about animal groups, especially social groups of animals. And I'm always the first to say we anthropomorphize animals at our risk, and that's exactly what I've gone and done. But it's all under the auspices of these little guys being genetically altered and changed by their distant masters. I guess to answer your question, and by the way, I'm very aware that my articulacy has diminished and my ability to waffle has increased as this interview has gone on.
Oh, I love it. It's great.
It's fine. Apologies. I'm running low on tea here. The thing that made Angelic unput-downable for me, utterly compelling as an idea, is that it combines so many of my most cherished preoccupations in a quite tidy, organic way. And I'm talking specifically about religion, and I'm talking specifically about culture, and I'm talking about the world, the sort of eco aspects of it all. I'm talking about war, and I'm talking about, as I've just said, the kind of childlike wonder of the world that we all once had, and probably none of us have anymore. It's the reason that I said yes to doing the Dark Crystal book, because the whole film, and therefore the whole comic, is about recapturing the sense of wonder that we all once had. And it's the same with Cora and her companion, who I'm not going to say anything about because he's kind of fun, but they are explicitly being starved of wonder as a result of their very different cultural positions. And so they just, like children always will, especially brave, wonderful, curious, quizzical ones, they just go, fuck it, we're going to go find some wonder. Mm-hmm. And off they go. And they sort of find out an awful lot of stuff almost by accident on the way. And they encounter all sorts of danger, and they get wrapped up in the very grown-up machinations of their tribes as they go. But frankly, they just want to have adventures, and that's kind of really lovely. I just wanted to tell a story that had all the trappings of complexity that you just sort of brush aside because people want to go and have adventures.
I do think that's what makes Cora a perfect gateway for the book, because she is clearly the one who just wants to go out and have adventures and go into the areas. I'm trying to remember how it's phrased, like the areas that they're not supposed to go to. Alfred has a specific phrase for that.
Outer bounds.
What? Oh, exactly. Outer bounds. Yeah. I love that, and it's just like she craves the outer bounds. People want to escape their boundaries. They want to go to the places they're not supposed to, and I don't know. I think Cora is a fantastic gateway.
Thank you. That's. I mean, we're still in that kind of. I've spent, both of us, Caspar and I, have spent so long with these characters, and so long kind of shuffling around one line of dialogue or moving the shape of the head and just tweak fiddle that I just have no idea anymore whether it's any good or not. So every time I hear these wonderful little bits of feedback, it's incredibly reassuring.
Well, so the last thing I'm going to ask you about, though, is the monk speak, because I have to ask about the language. I don't know where people land on this anymore, but monk speak kind of reminds me of a less ridiculous, more species-specific version of the far, far, far future dialogue from David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas in the film adaptation.
Sure.
I think it's great. When it came to developing like the varying English dialects and how the adults speak and how the monks speak and everything like that, what did you turn to? Was that just all your internal language rules, or were there guiding lights, or what?
It's something. It always bewilders me a little bit. And by the way, I should add, just as a little behind the scenery, that I toned it down a lot. The first version of the PDF that I sent out to a couple of friends, they came back. They were like, "We love this, but I do worry, Si, that it's going to turn off an awful lot of people because, if you're halfway through the second panel on page one and you're already going, I don't really understand what that person's saying, then you're probably getting them switching off in their droves. So yeah, I've gone back and the version that will be published is it's far more user friendly and everybody seems to be pretty happy with it. But for me, that sort of patois, I guess it just sort of comes a little bit intuitively, and that bothers me. Like, it's something Alan Moore does all the time. He did it in Halo Jones. He did it with the Crossed 100 stuff that he did, which I ended up taking over. He's done it in two of his novels, in Voice of the Fire and in Jerusalem. It's just... It's something to do with getting your ear in, if that makes sense. As soon as you understand the voice that you're hearing, PS seeing, then it becomes completely obvious and completely intuitive. And it slightly confuses me when people say, oh, I didn't understand a word that character was saying. Well, it's obvious. And I guess I'm operating from a position of bias because I'm writing the fucking thing and I'm sitting here at my desk and all I do is talk out loud. I've never written a line of dialogue that I haven't sat here saying out loud. Mm-hmm. Which, by the way, drives Emma absolutely mad. So she's got a thick door on her office downstairs. But yeah, for each of these different factions in Angelic, there is a different kind of voice. As I've said already, with the monks, it's as simple as they're kids in a kindergarten, and kids are very good at kind of misappropriating words, getting them slightly wrong. And they think that they've heard a thing a particular way, and that's how they'll use it forever, even though it's not right. Like, this is a crap example, but I have my nephew staying with us at the weekend. He's 4, and somebody, that song, If You Like Pina Colada, it comes on the radio, right? And he spends all weekend going, if you like pina lada, because that's what he heard, and that's therefore what it became. And that's kind of how the monks talk. It's not that overt. It's not all the way. I've made very careful attempts to keep it clear, but yeah, like the example we just gave, outer bounds. We know because we're adult grown-ups who can speak English that they mean out of bounds. But if you've only heard somebody saying out of bounds, then that's probably what you think that means, and it makes perfect sense that it's called the outer bounds. And that's the sort of wordplay that I A, enjoy, and B, don't find very difficult. Right. So it just goes in there without me thinking, and then I have other people saying you should probably pull that back a bit because it's a little bit impenetrable. The dolts, who are these kind of cybernetically enhanced flying dolphins, in my mind they sound just like a bunch of Victorian British gentlemen waiting to go on a fox hunt. Yeah. So they're sitting around on their horses going, yes, I must go, I must go. Sport. All that stuff. So, and then the other faction, which we haven't quite encountered yet, and I can't really spoil much about, in my mind, they sound like kind of fine Georgians in the old mold. What I do declare, all that stuff. So, yeah, and it doesn't really matter whether that's what the reader is hearing in their voice when they read these things, as long as it feels distinct and clear. Mm-hmm. Then immediately you've got a faction. And by the way, this goes back to what we were saying about lettering. If part of creating a distinct voice is, yes, the use of syntax, the use of words, but if you can help that by using a specific visual identity for those words, then you're already one step ahead. So yeah, it's just another example that in comics, really every single element can be obsessed over and can be very useful.
Yeah, I do want to say 2 really quick things. One, I imagine that the dolts belong to a country club. I don't know why.
Absolutely. Yes.
That was what I decided.
No women allowed country club. One of those.
Exactly. Sport.
Sport.
But the other thing is like I feel like the monk language has a beautiful simplicity, and I was going to bring up the children thing too, because a phrase that stands out to me is Nobedient. It's like disobedient just feels like there's a lot of arbitrary rules that just don't make a lot of sense to kids, which make them ask why, which is a very core thing to do. But I mean, Nobedient has like a beautiful logic to it. It just makes sense. And so I like that because it's there's a simplicity and a logic to it that just feels like I don't know what a future distillation of English might be like.
Sure, and that's exactly what I was talking about. And I love that you love that, by the way. We came very close to calling the whole book Nobedient, by the way. But
oh, really?
Yeah. We loved Angelic just a little bit too much. But yes, that's one of the. There's a few words like that I guess the trick is imagining what however long you've lived, you've seen language evolve. New words pop up all the time, and they're usually portmanteaus or contractions or transmutations of words that already exist. And so to me, it just sort of feels pretty natural to speculate on how a childish culture in the far future might use these words. But as I've said, for me, the trick is not coming up with these terms, but reining myself in so that they don't become completely impenetrable.
Yeah, well, I can say that Angelic is a fantastic book, and it's certainly not impenetrable. Si, thank you so much for coming on and chatting about Angelic with me.
Pleasure, mate. I'm sorry for waffling on so much. I imagine I'm keeping you from going to work or whatever.
Oh, yeah. You're not restricting me too
much.
I should be thanking you for keeping me away from work. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure, mate.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Si Spurrier. You can find Si on Twitter at Si Spurrier, on his website at simonspurrier.co.uk, and his work in books like The Spire, Cry Havoc, and the upcoming Angelic at Image Comics. If you're a fan of the show, there's some big news. Off Panel now has a Patreon. If you like the show and want to support it, consider backing it on Patreon at patreon.com/offpanel. There are fun rewards and insider information you can get if you do. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Phil Knoll, Ian Maxfield, Benjamin Shipper, Barry Straw, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Dan Lee, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Iovino, Christopher Carter, Nicholas Kesslake, Brian Dickerson, Greg Rucka, Ryan Mail, Adam Highfill, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corrigan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Johan Barander, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Matt Battaglia, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art San Francisco. You guys are all the best. Don't forget to like the show on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD, follow it on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or follow me at @slicefriedgold. Want more from Off Panel? Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating and review while you're at it. A quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from their album Volmilch opens and closes the show now. Give them a listen, as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in later this week for another episode.